Just hide in the bathroom waiting to ambush me.
Colleges can charge whatever because, oh, well, the government's going to pay for it. Which means that because you're guaranteed government aid, while it's good because it guarantees everyone has a chance to get into college, which I have no problem with everyone having a chance to get into college, the way it's set up means that they can charge whatever they want. Whereas if you had to earn government aid, you had to qualify and demonstrate, one, usually by having some credit score, and two, showing that you have a dedication to school and having a qualification for government aid, it would mean that since it's not a guarantee, not every single person would go to college. Well, if not every person can go to college because they can't afford it, that's fewer people walking through the door at the university. And the fewer people walking through the door at the university is less money for the university, meaning that they'd have to lower the prices to make it so more people can come in financially. Because I don't think finance should be the threshold for going to school. Did it just crash? I don't think finance should be the threshold for going to school. But I do think that there has to be a solution to make it so that people can still go to school without having to spend $40,000 a semester. I think that has to change.
Hi.
But that's the America problem. The Japan problem is because the expectations are so strong on everything succeeding, and if you don't succeed, you're a nobody and you're a lesser than your, bosses, and there's a structure where you have to talk to people based on their rank in a certain way, and there's different.
Is that why there's such a big trope of high school suicides and such in media?
It's not a trope. There's a lot of high school suicides in Japan
because of this sort of thing, I guess.
Yes, because
of stress.
If they're not doing well and they know that they're never going to succeed in education,
it's already over.
Then they're going to be some worthless peon at the bottom who all they do is their job and they can't. What? This keeps happening. Where that, I don't think for a minute that a person who works retail is worthless.
No, because someone has to do it or there won't be retail.
Not only that, but
we've been there.
Every job deserves respect. If it's a job, I don't think that drug dealer deserves respect. It's not a job.
No,
it's someone exploiting people and hurting people by getting people addicted to things.
They're a burden.
Yeah. I think that if you have a job and you're working it and you have good work ethic, you deserve respect.
Janitors are important.
Oh, hell yeah. I think janitors are sometimes more important than some of the jobs that they're cleaning whatever for.
More important than the floor they're cleaning?
Yeah. And so, and the other thing is, I can tell you that a lot of janitors know a lot of stuff. Because most janitors have to end up learning how to fix different things. They have to learn how to keep things clean and what chemicals you don't want next to each other. And there's a lot of really important life skills you can learn being a janitor.
Right.
You just also have to clean toilets, which sucks.
There's a difference between an important job and a glamorous job.
Yeah. And, but then the other thing
if a job really was nothing, it wouldn't be a job.
Yeah. The other thing with that is, in Japan, even once they get past all that frustrating life that you have in school where you're expected that you have to do this and you have to meet these requirements and you have to do this and make sure that you get a good business degree so you can go whatever. Once you get that, if you work in Japan, it's not uncommon to have to work 60 hours a week. It's not uncommon for... There's a guy who I watched a video on where he is a hairstylist, and he's a good hairstylist, and he wanted to visit Europe. And one of the worries he had was if he went, he'd have to take 2 weeks off, and couldn't afford, not even the cost of travel, he couldn't afford to take the 2 weeks off because those 2 weeks' pay themselves were so important. Who worked every day of the week for 15 hours. and spent almost no time with his family because he worked all the time.
And this is the benefit of that school hell.
Yeah, and
His work hell.
and he wasn't a unique story. I've heard multiple stories like this. This was just one where they actually talked to him and discussed it in detail.
Oh, you're not,
and they have
you're not allowed to complain about your job unless you're drunk.
Yeah, so that's another thing, is you don't file complaints at your job. There's no such thing as there's not no such thing. I'm sure they exist, and I'm sure there's still legal precautions and stuff taken if you go there. But you don't complain about your job.
It's
and there's
cultural
not
taboo.
harassment isn't talked about. It's not addressed. And
Whereas in the U.S.,
there's a whole
everyone,
other issue with the fact that there's a lot of creepers in Japan.
in the U.S.,
because of-
everyone complains about their job.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. To customers, which I also think can be a really, really, really bad thing.
but you're free to, at least.
Yeah. But in Japan, yeah, you don't complain at your job except for after work, people go out and drink. And they'll go out and drink with their boss, and they'll go and get drunk and hit on their boss's wife. And
I
that's
guess
okay because everybody's drunk.
So basically, it's just not culturally liable for anything you do while you're drunk, or say.
Yeah, there's
And that's just
actually like a term for it.
felony?
Yeah, there's actually like a term for it. I can't think of what it is. But yeah, when you're basically get out of jail free for anything that's not, as you said, like a literal jail.
I say if you're gonna have that, like,
When
you
you're
guys will
drunk.
outlaw alcohol.
And
You having trouble there, guy?
but yeah, so there's
He was dancing. He was dancing. Okay.
But between all three of these things, one, it makes joining the workforce very unappealing to people. Two, it's hard to join their workforce because if you're from outside of the country, it's hard to get in.
Get an extra guess on hacking. I mean, I guess that's a convenience.
And science.
More important. What? There's no skills.
Oh, that's right.
You can put it upside down though, so that's cool. And again, permanent upgrade.
So it's hard to go to the country to get a job, especially a permanent job, especially a residence, especially citizenship, to make it a lifelong experience if you wanted to be a Japanese citizen and work in Japan and live in Japan. It's not a job that a lot of people can get because it's so hard. And three, because their own people don't want to fill those slots because society has such strict and traditional and strong expectations of them, it makes it so that they don't want to have kids. Meaning that it's at a point in society where, like, I think it's in the next 30 years, if they don't find a solution for it, there's going to be too many openings in the workforce to keep the country functioning, like, at all. And that's scary.
I mean, something's gonna just have to break.
Yeah, it's one of those where it's a very abnormal type of national collapse. Usually when you hear about a national collapse, it's rioting in the streets, or it's the government cracks down and oppresses people so much that everyone's fleeing the country or whatever. But this place, it's a beautiful place to be, and the people there are good people.
It's just that the society's pressuring them in weird directions.
Yeah, but they're pressured in a way that makes it so that there's not going to be anyone to do any jobs in 30 years, which is very peculiar. And so I definitely don't think Japan is without bizarre criticisms. And
I think every society has
and that's what it really comes down to, is there's no perfect society. Anyone who assumes there's a perfect society is foolish, or doesn't know enough about the society they're talking about.
They're ignorant.
To realize that it's nowhere near perfect.
Oh no, they have a hand.
And I think that's true of most structures of how a society can work, and most economic structures and things like that is...
Because people are imperfect.
Yeah.
You can't have a perfect society of imperfect people.
Because, like, I've heard people try and argue that if you had an autocratic regime with a benevolent leader, that would be a perfect society, because they would always make the right decision. I'm like, But there's no people who will make the right decision every time. That doesn't exist. There's no such thing.
And even if they are, what about their successor?
Yeah, and not even what about their successor. What about the people who want that power and will kill that guy to get that power?
Oh, he showed me a video of it about why you can't have a perfect ruler. It's because it means the people directly below them need to be similarly perfect.
Yes.
Or the ruler won't be able to enact his perfect benevolence.
Yeah, and it also comes back to absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. Everyone, when given enough power, will eventually make some sort of decisions that are bad and dangerous. Because maybe in their mind it makes sense.
It probably
but
does.
Functionally, it may not. So you could have like one of the most common ones is you'll see a lot of people who haven't been in the societies, because I've talked to people from those societies personally, and I've heard these kinds of things from them and had conversations about it, who will say that communism is perfect and communism is so good, and the only reason that we've never had perfect societies because no one's ever enacted communism perfectly. One, you can't because humans aren't perfect. And two, there are a lot of problems that come from those type of situations that aren't acknowledged by someone who doesn't understand it. So you have like a person saying communism is perfect because then everyone can do what they want. Next question. Who's plowing the farm? Oh, well, someone will fill that. Well, what are you going to do when you're in this society? Oh, well, I would do art. Yeah, so will they, and so will they, and so will they. Who's plowing the fields? Who's running the factories? No one likes those jobs now.
But someone
if
has
you
to
don't
do it.
have to, then who's going to do the job?
Unless we can get robots to do it.
Yeah, and if you get robots to do it, then who's going to take care of the robots? Who's going to be the one person working to fix the robots while everyone else is doing art?
I work in a factory, so I know that machines need babysitting.
Oh yeah, and that's the other thing.
Ooh, medic.
That as we get farther in society, where we get to what's called the post-human aspect of society, being where there's actually a really good video by, I think it's CGP Grey, called Humans Need Not Apply, talking about as robots take more jobs, what it means.
Oh, goodness.
What it means for society.
I forgot to take your stuff. Damn it.
Drop it off from an...
Yeah, I forgot to take your stuff from her. So now she's still fat too.
Yep, so you're gonna have to go back up. You're gonna have to drop stuff and go back up.
I'm at the end.
But what are you gonna do? You can't bring any of it up. You gotta go back up.
Yeah, I dropped one.
But he talks about it, and one, you have this sense of anomie that will develop from it. This is a common thing in sociology that they talk about, anomie. A-N-O-M-I-E. It is the lack of sense of purpose causing anxiety within a person.
Huh.
If nobody has...
capitalization.
If society has moved past the point where humans need to have jobs, there will be people who don't have anything to do. Say they have no interest in art. Say they have no interest in creative venues, which is what would mostly be left, but they don't have the technical proficiency to be the thing fixer for the robots.
Me.
They won't have a job. And while people talk about, oh, if I had no job, everything would be great, I've talked to hundreds of retired people. So many retired people. I've talked to a lot of retired people because of the jobs I've had in the past, being near places with, like, elderly homes and stuff like that. Retired people often will get another job they don't need because they can't stay at home anymore. It drives them crazy. They can't go hang out with their friends because they're 95 and they don't have any friends anymore. They go out to... I know people who made a recreational experience out of going to the grocery store every day to talk to people because at home was lonely. At home there was nothing to do. They didn't feel loved. They didn't feel like they had a reason. And it would make them depressed. So you get what's called anomie. And as you have more machines taking these jobs and stuff, it takes sense of purpose away from people. at the same time, it's good because it's taking you leveled up. It's
Oh, yeah,
taking
yeah.
it's taking burdens off of people that we don't need to make a burden, and making it so that society is more streamlined and faster and productive, and
Alright, my charisma is where I need it to be. Now I just need another level. I can set up the good thing.
and you have like enough food for more people. You don't have enough food for everybody, as you can see, because people still starve, and that's something that I think could be fixed more than it is, but isn't yet. I think it's possible one day that you could get to a point where you could feed everybody and it not be a political issue. Um, but
Just safe somewhere.
is it up there? Oh, that's a calendar. I mean, it's kind of like a safe. It has numbers and it's rectangle shaped. But yeah, so as the machines take the jobs, the other thing is you have, before you get to what is a post-human society, you're taking more and more jobs away, which means you have more people at the bottom who may not have those skills, which those are the first jobs to go, are your menial labor jobs. You're going to have more quarries where the robots take the rocks and they throw them into the automated dump trucks, and the automated dump trucks take them to a site. Those kinds of things are going to be the first jobs to go. The janitorial service is going to fully become robots cleaning stuff, and you'll have technical repair people who take and fix those robots, and there won't be a person cleaning the toilets. There won't be a person cleaning the floor. There won't be a person doing this or that. You'll
On
have
surface, that
robots.
seems great.
It sounds good until you realize you'll have. So there was this big joke for a long time, and I don't like going into this because it does get kind of political. You had in South Park, they do a thing where they have people coming from out of town and they're taking your gerbs, and they blame
That's a
it on,
meme.
and they blame it on foreign people, whatever. Which there is a concern for that. I don't think that there aren't problems with bringing in people without them being documented, without them being properly paid, and them working for below minimum wage, causing the cost
That is a
to
big
hire a
can of worms,
person
though.
lower. Yeah, there's a huge political quagmire with that I don't want to talk about because I try to keep that off the channel. But what people don't acknowledge when they have those conversations is that robots are taking our jobs. And that's true. And as that goes, what's going to happen is the people in the lowest tiers, the people with the jobs that require the least amount of education, the least amount of this and that, those jobs are going to disappear. Well, then you have an entire section of the workforce that can't do a job because, oh, well, robots will do that, and they'll do it cheaper, and they'll do it faster.
But they still need a job.
Yeah. You still got to pay for food. You still have to have it.
That's
well,
not
you
gonna
can't just
work.
enact some sort of blanket
Nobody has to work.
way to feed all those people that wouldn't be someone else literally just paying for them to do that. Like there was one video I watched where someone was talking about a form of government aid and how it functions and saying, oh yeah, well we should make that free for everyone. And they said, well, who's going to pay for that? And the guy's response, a college educated guy, probably a junior by about his age and how he looked and whatever, goes, wait, you'd have to pay for that? It doesn't come for free. Someone's got to pay for it.
And yeah.
Yeah, and so you're going to have the guy who makes, $60,000 a year, who's now the bottom tier, because everything below that is those menial jobs that are gone, paying for those, and then their job's going to disappear. And so the idea of reaching post-human isn't as realistic as people talk about, because you can't go from having jobs all the way down the tier of most important but least skills required to most glamorous but not really requiring skills, where only the glamorous jobs are left, or the non-jobs in some cases, like influencer.
There's going to be some hurdles that just...
Yeah.
You can't take that step.
Yeah, you literally can't.
It's
you
too
can't
big.
make it where you have a whole section of the workplace just disappear, because someone has to be able to pay for the food for their kids.
You can't just fully automate all jobs.
Yeah, you literally have to basically go 10 steps ahead and then reel it back, and it's unreasonable.
It's zip zap. Hey, I'm trying. Disarm button not work. Oh,
It won't work once it starts.
I had not heard that. I mean, I guess that makes sense. Thankfully, it doesn't do much.
And so it hit in CGP Gray's video on it. He's specifically talking about how, while it sounds like a utopia on the surface, it's not, because there are inherent problems that make it destructive to society. Because one, you have people who feel like they have no sense of worth if you manage to jump that hurdle. But two, in getting to that point, you leave a bunch of people either homeless, impoverished, no job, and no way to get a job. And then you have... So in the United States, there's a disconnect in society. There's the rural and the urban. And I'll say, from the conversations I've had with people, it seems like the rural people are more understanding of urban problems than the urban people are of rural problems.
See, I don't even know the difference there.
Do you know what the words rural and urban mean?
Not really.
Okay, so rural means lives in the countryside, lives out of town,
Like me.
lives, you know.
Got it.
And then suburban is people who live outside of the cities but in populated smaller centers, traditionally, is kind of how it works. So, but the disconnect is, traditionally suburban people end up lumped in with urban in this case because those problems tend to be the same problems. What you'll see is political issue that I won't want to talk about becomes a problem in the city. And the solution is to get rid of whatever that thing is by doing A. Well, by doing that, they want to enact it as, say, a statewide thing, where A is banned. Well, then, all the people who are in it... I guess the most general way I can talk about this is one that I have heard from people where, on the extreme end of gun control, you'll have places that want to ban guns statewide. Well, if you live out in the countryside, say you're a farmer, for example, is a great example. You have a farmer who takes care of cattle. And there's something that comes, I guess a better example would be, takes care of goats, something smaller. And a pack of wolves comes and wants your goats.
Yeah, you want to shoot at them.
You want to be able, one, to protect your goats, and two, you can't call the sheriff's department and expect them to be there in 3 minutes to get rid of the wolves. So you can't have someone else take care of the wolves. And it's similar to, I guess another example of where this comes into play is with fire departments. Is they talk about volunteer versus paid fire departments. And the problems with paid fire departments...
Ooh, wait, I haven't had a plasma pistol yet. Neat.
But what ends up happening is, if some person way out in the middle of nowhere has a fire...
What do?
You can't call and have a fireman... A lot of times what ends up happening is you'll have either some sort of local volunteer fire department that's in this kind of out in the middle of nowhere neighborhood with their one school and whatever's out in this small rural area. And that will take care of it, but they won't have the full equipment. If the fire gets too big, you just gotta call it a loss. They just lose their farm.
And that sucks.
It's horrible. But it's one of those where if you were to explain that to a person living in the city, they'd be like, I mean, I can call the fire department and they'll be here in 3 minutes.
Yeah, but
you don't live 45 miles from the nearest city. And so you'll have these kind of issues come up. Or you'll have...
okay, I'm only using gold.
And you'll see a lot of these where you'll see... And where the biggest problems come from is, one, you'll see a lot of urban people make fun of rural people for their problems. Or assume things about rural people without knowing what it is. Like, I know people who said that, you know, all people who live more than 50 miles from a city are racist. Or whatever. Like, whatever your claim of the day is, all of them are... a really common one you'll say is they all date their cousins, or whatever. Just dumb assumptions. That's probably the safest dumb assumption, because it's one where you're not going to open a different can of worms. Because in all these places, yes, there are whatever. There are probably racist people out there. There are whatever. They
But-
exist.
But people are people.
But again, as it said with the a person is smart, people are dumb situation, it's stupid to assume the whole group when you don't know that person. But with those assumptions, you'll end up having also people will vote for the governor, and because large populaces have collected and they have more than half the population of the country, and most cities tend to generally think similarly to one another, not all. If you look at Texas, you can see that. You can see how different Houston from Austin, how different San Antonio to Austin. They're all very different. But if you look at most cities, they tend to think more politically along certain lines. They tend to think more economically along certain lines, and they have certain societal expectations of how things work and what's expected of people. And I guess a really good example of it is the ADA is a very useful and very important thing, but some of the ADA requirements are very difficult on small businesses. Having to install a ramp if you're renting from an old place that doesn't have one, or having to change all the door handles or things like that in either a startup company or at the time when it was enacted years ago, footing this bill for all of these changes having to come into play over time, which is why they made, I think, certain parts of it grandfathered in, because you can't just force someone to have to fix this all right away. It's a lot of money. But if you're, building this and you have to take in all these different things, and if you don't read that to a letter, there are certain people who will come out and they'll sue you for it, even if they don't have those issues, and it wasn't ever an issue because there were so like one of the good examples is there were certain places where they had ramps that were too steep because they didn't have the driveway length. And there was no way to make that ramp because it was built 40 years ago and they couldn't just buy part of the street to build a ramp.
So now they're in trouble for it.
But the solution that the people came up with was it had never been a problem in the town because the owner would personally push the wheelchairs up the ramp to help people get up. It wasn't a problem in the town. It was a little town of 100 people, and there were people in the town who did have to use the ramp, and they would just, he left the door open, barring the worst conditions, and even in the worst conditions, he would watch out the window and see if there was someone in a wheelchair. He didn't come in, walk them up the ramp. And so it wasn't ever an issue. They came up with a solution in this town, it was no problem. And someone came to town who was a lawyer and looked at it and said, oh, this grade's too steep. We're going to file a thing with the government. And the store closed down. It was the only grocery store in that town.
Oh, no.
And now the people had to travel from the city, or from this little town, to the big city to buy groceries.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
And no, this guy didn't have good intentions.
Oh.
They actually had, because it was actually, I think,
Damn.
indictment of this guy of how he would go from town to town and deliberately look for things to file lawsuits to make money out of it.
God damn.
And so the ADA is a good example. In a city, it makes a lot of sense because in a city you have to have ways for people to streamline motion, because out in a rural area you can have a guy where he might expect 65 people to come in a day and he can walk them all in the store. Well, if you have 3,000 people come through your door every day, you can't have someone push people up the ramp as a job. So you have to come up with a solution. And so you have your gradual slope ramps, the zigzag or whatever, if you can buy that much property. And so I don't have any problem with the ADA. I think it's great. I have a problem with people who exploit the ADA to, file lawsuits against random people or whatever. I think that's pretty crappy.
Yeah.
But it was enacted and voted for, and the decisions were made a lot by people who lived in cities. And what ends up happening is you have a lot of kind of laws on the book that are federal laws that aren't quite as strictly enforced in small towns. One, because they don't have the force to deal with it, and they don't have lawyers to deal with it or whatever. So unless it becomes a state issue, you're not going to see anyone come across it. But two, because the society functions different in a small town, they will have either solutions come up, like pushing people up the ramp.
Someone needs a food.
They'll come up with solutions that way, or they'll come up with solutions by fudging the rules, kind of, because no one cares in that town. Which I don't like the fudging the rules, but if you have to come up with a solution to keep society running, I mean, it's the ones that walk away from no loss kind of situation, I guess. But so you'll see a lot of these laws enacted because you'll have a large enough city population make the decision on behalf of the rural areas, and the rural areas will either completely suffer from it, or it won't function. Like, you just can't do that in those places, and so it just kind of becomes a non-law because the police can't do anything about it because it just doesn't work.
Rules that are neither enforced nor followed
Are meaningless.
Those really frustrate me.
Yeah.
For some, I guess I might be a bit of just a stickler for rules, but
Oh, I mean, I've become very cynical. Going to college made me very cynical in some ways in and of itself, but also just modern society has made me
in my workplace, you have so many rules that are just repeated, posted everywhere. Pre-work meetings will repeat them, and no one follows them, and none of the supervisors do anything about it.
So one, there's
it's noise.
there's with these things that are decided by the city, you have what's called rules for thee but not for me, where groups of people will be above the law in those cultures, despite the fact that they're championing everyone else follow them, which I think is a gross thing. I mean, I find hypocrisy disgusting all the time.
I mean,
I find it I find it an insult of people's intelligence to assume that people are dumb enough they won't see through whatever. But also you have the rules, as you're saying, that are in name only.
Alright.
The problem with rules in name only is once they become in name only, and I can tell you this from the places I've worked, you'll have things that say are an OSHA requirement, a federal law requirement for human safety, where it's become a non-rule for so long in a place that you'll get in trouble for following that rule. And so, like, an example I've heard from people who I know who work in warehouses is they have a deadline. They have to get...
Oh my god!
Yeah.
Deadlines!
They have a deadline where you have to get all these crates filled because this has to be delivered on Tuesday so it can get there by Thursday.
And
then,
the work pace has been set with the assumption that you're not following all these rules.
Yes.
And if you do follow these rules, you can't realistically meet this mandatory deadline.
And
I've seen
there's
traces
two,
of that.
Yeah, there's two sides of this that both lead to problems and need to be addressed. One is, what happens is, in these warehouses, there'll be 4 shelves. And one of the biggest things you'll see is if you look at certain